What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are continuing coverage of the new faction reveals for 10th edition Warhammer 40k, today with Chaos Space Marines. In the last couple videos, we've covered Space Marines and Tyranids, and Games Workshop has committed to doing a faction reveal every weekday, so we're going to dive right into this one as well. And Chaos Space Marines look absolutely sick. Now, unlike the other factions we've had at reveal so far, Chaos Space Marines don't have as much of a reliance on existing mechanics that have already been shown off, at least based on what's been shown in the article thus far. Chaos Space Marines look like they're going to be based around doing lots of damage and exchanging potentially their own wound to empower their attacks with dark pacts from the Chaos Gods, which is insanely fluffy. This is embodied in the new army rule Dark Pacts, which allow any Heretic Astartes unit to gain lethal hits, that is auto-wounding on hit rolls of a 6 or critical hit rolls, or sustained hits, which is additional hits on critical hits, so exploding 6s essentially on any of its attacks. It chooses when it attacks, but if it does, after the attack is resolved, it makes a Dark Pact. That is a leadership check. If it's failed, it takes D3 mortal wounds. And it seems like there's going to be a lot of mechanics within the faction that check whether or not this leadership check is failed, and potentially give you additional bonuses or help you pass your Dark Pact leadership checks. The article also mentions that this is available to everything in the army, including things like cultists, which means that it seems like the units that will benefit most dearly from these Dark Pacts may also be the ones that are most susceptible to taking mortal wounds from them. Those low leadership but high model count units would love to get that auto wounding on 6's effect with masses of auto gunshots or melee attacks, and the downside being that their leadership is probably going to be terrible, so they're almost certainly going to lose D3 models to that failure. Now, what we don't have so far are detachment abilities for any Heretic Astartes detachments, so one thing to keep in mind is that this army ability, while it is already seems pretty good, it is going to be stacked on top of detachment rules that we don't know of quite yet. We have a couple stratagems and things being revealed in this article, but not actually the abilities that the detachments grant, so there are going to be additional effects that Heretic Astartes armies are going to be able to benefit from. Now, some of the units that can benefit from these are also being spoiled. We do see a couple of data sheets in this article. The first one being the Heretic Legionnaires. This one actually has a front side of the card where we can see unit composition as well as war gear options. And we see basically a cleanup of the war gear section from the 9th edition version of the Legionnaire unit. Legionnaires have always been able to take enormous varieties of different weapons within their unit, being a tactical marine style unit. That's just generally sort of how they work, and that has made their datasheet kind of nightmarish in the past, and it's still very complicated, but it's not quite as bad as it was previously. Gone are the melee or heavy or special weapon lists. Instead, what we have is the armory card. So in the past, you could have Legionnaires upgraded with something from a list of heavy weapons, for example, and then you would have to go reference that list somewhere else. Those lists are now just on the card. However, a lot of the profiles for their weapons may be on a separate card that's also included within the index. And that's going to be pretty easy for quick reference for stuff that they can't fit on the datasheet because it would have too many weapon options. Another thing that we're seeing simplified is the rolling of a lot of weapons into the heavy melee weapon profile. Previously, aspiring champions within the Legionnaire units had the selection of a ton of different individual melee weapons like power mauls and chain axes and things like that. Now those are all just going to be heavy melee weapons. They can either take accursed weapons, which we've seen in the past, Astartes chain swords, and those heavy melee weapon profiles. Now, flipping the card over to the front side, we can glean some interesting things. The first one and most interesting to me is the Astartes chainsword profile. It is the same as we've seen previously. Weapon skill 3, strength 4, AP 1, 1 damage. Pretty normal. It's an AP1 chainsword. The downside is that we don't see any ability to make attacks in addition to attacks made with another weapon. And if our assumption is true that you can only select one melee weapon profile to attack with, there's no longer going to be an incentive to take a melee weapon and a chainsword. Whereas in previous editions, you would make your normal attacks with whatever strong melee weapon you had, then an additional attack with each chainsword that you have. That's no longer the case. Now it seems like you either choose your stronger melee weapon weapon or your higher volume chainsword. It's one or the other, not both. This has huge implications for dual weapon melee units like Vanguard veterans, who are always incentivized to take 2 melee weapons, and that's probably no longer going to be the case. So we're probably going to see storm shields or pistols getting taken a lot more often with units like that. Now, obviously, there is the potential that there are special rules involved, or that the melee weapon selection process is a little bit different than how we've assumed it is, because we don't have confirmation from the articles quite yet, but it does seem pretty transformative. Now, in addition, we also get both the accursed weapon and heavy melee weapon profiles on this data sheet. Accursed weapon profile is kind of just an upgraded chainsword. It's +1 strength and +1 AP over the normal chainsword, but otherwise the same. The heavy melee weapon is pretty badass. Comes in at only 3 attacks, so you lose 1 over the accursed weapon, but strength 8 AP2 for a flat 2 damage. This is largely the Power Fist profile that we saw on Space Marine Terminators previously. It seems like that might also be getting rolled into the heavy melee weapon profile. Now, that strength 8 is going to be a little bit low, especially when punching vehicles. You have to remember that most vehicles have gone up to a minimum of toughness 9, so it's going to be wounding most vehicles on 5s, but it will be wounding most of the infantry in the game on 3s. And at that AP2 2 damage, it's a pretty strong profile to kill through medium infantry like opposing Heretic Legionnaires. Now, once we're talking about these melee weapons, it's also important to talk about the Legionnaires' Veterans of the Long War ability. It gives them reroll wound rolls of 1 in melee all the time, and full wound rerolls in melee against units on objective markers. This is functionally identical to the ability that we saw in yesterday's video on Gene Stealers. It only affects their melee attacks. Gene Stealers not having a ranged attack means that that doesn't make a difference. But Gene Stealers are also a very fast and aggressive melee unit, meaning that most of the time they're going to be benefiting from it off of your opponent's objectives. Legionnaires, however, are much more defensively oriented. They don't have scout, they're a much slower movement value, and they have some pretty strong ranged attacks to boot. So I think most often this is going to be used to clear aggressive enemies off your own objectives, and that makes Legionnaires really strong backline objective holders. You really can't let 5 Legionnaires just sit around on your back objective, because not only do they have pretty strong ranged attacks, but they also get full rerolls in melee with all of these Astartes chainswords and heavy melee weapon profiles that the unit might be packing, which is kind of terrifying. The Chaos Icon is also an interesting upgrade that can be taken on anyone in the unit. It gives you reroll leadership tests for your Dark PACTS ability, and again, this is going to be one of the pieces of interaction that we see with that Dark PACTS army rule, where you're going to have buffs and abilities that interact with that army ability. Being able to give these guys exploding hits in melee with a reroll on your leadership check, so there's less of a chance that you fail and take D3 mortal wounds, and then with those exploding hits get full rerolls to wound on an objective, makes Legionnaires actually sort of disgustingly scary when fighting over their home objectives. On top of that, they also have a great selection of ranged attacks, including the upgraded Balefire Tome profile, which unfortunately, like all the other psychic abilities, has been turned into just a regular gun. 2 attacks at strength 5, AP 1, 1 damage. It definitely seems like strength 5 AP 1 is where Games Workshop is opting that psychic profile to be. Whether it's 1 or 2 damage, that depends on exactly the style of smite, but we've seen that in both the Space Marine Librarian and the Swarm Lord. They both have that strength 5 AP 1 profile in their psychic abilities. Some other interesting standouts from this are the Havoc autocannon. It remains a 2-shot heavy weapon, but has moved up to strength 9. Now, obviously, this is because the base toughness of vehicles in the game has also moved to strength 9. So strength 9 is mostly the equivalent of strength 7, at least when attacking enemy heavy armor. That said, it is much better against lighter infantry. Now it's wounding toughness 4 enemies on 2s, whereas previously it was wounding them on 3s. It has lost a pip of AP, going down to AP 1, but comes in at a damage characteristic of 3, and this makes it pretty dangerous against even units like Terminators. The Reaper Chain Cannon is also in here, which has, I think, kind of hilariously gotten a little bit of a downgrade, going to a 4+ ballistic scale rather than the previous 3+. It was a heavy weapon previously, and because it was relatively short range, I think the assumption is that you were moving and shooting it. So it goes back to its 3+ ballistic scale if you're staying still. Reasonably, it's kind of the same, but it doesn't feel as good, especially compared to things like that autocannon having the heavy attribute built in, meaning that when you're able to stand still and shoot 48 inches across the table, which is going to be pretty often, you're going to be hitting on 2s rather than 3s. Overall, this data sheet is awesome. These Legionnaires seem pretty sweet, but in addition, this is one of the first iterations of the battle line keyword that we've seen. This means that these guys can be taken in any number in your army, ignoring the rule of 3 that other units have to abide by. Now, what's going to be buffing these masses of Heretic Legionnaires are going to be throwing across the table, and that is the upgraded version of Abaddon the Despoiler. Abaddon's basically meant to go toe-to-toe with Guilliman and has a lot of mirrored mechanics. His base stat block has had a little bit of a downgrade. He is now movement 5 thanks to that Terminator armor and only toughness 5 instead of 6, but he retains his 2+ armor save and 4+ invulnerable save. He retains his wounds characteristic, but importantly has lost his phase cap, making him much easier to kill. And I think this is generally going to be the trend that we see for characters. A lot of defensive mechanics that characters have had previously have been removed, and instead they're just going to be inserted into extremely resilient units thanks to the leader ability. Now, we don't have the backside of Abaddon's card, so we don't know what he can leader into, but it's likely he'll be able to go into Chaos Terminator units, and you're supposed to be taking him with a big brick of Terminators. He also has an impressive leadership value of 5, which is extremely important in this faction because of all the leadership tests you'll have to take thanks to that Dark PACTS ability, and a pretty reasonable objective control value of 4. Now, the headliner for Abaddon is going to be his War Master ability, and this is basically the same mechanic that we've seen from Guilliman, where in your command phase he has a selection of 3 abilities you can choose from, and he gains one of those for the remainder of the battle round. These are either Paragon of Hatred, that gives him a 6-inch Chapter Master aura, meaning you reroll any hit rolls for any Heretic Astartes unit within 6 inches of him. The core keyword has been entirely removed in this edition. I think we can basically say that with certainty now, meaning that this is old school 8th edition rerolls. You can reroll for anyone within that aura, including Land Raiders, Khorne Lords of Skull, Greater Brass Scorpions. Any of that stuff is going to be affected by this reroll aura, which is absolutely crazy. Combine that with the fact that you have Dark PACTS across the entire faction and can give yourself sustained hits. Rerolls are super valuable as long as any 6s that you roll on those rerolls are also going to explode into additional hits. So this Paragon of Hatred is already looking incredibly strong. Not to mention the fact that it affects Abaddon himself, meaning that he seems to be one of the first characters that we've seen in the game that has self rerolls built in as well. If you're looking to take an Alpha Strike and be a little bit more defensively oriented and potentially buff up a big, powerful brick that Abaddon is inhabiting, the Mark of Chaos Ascendant gives Heretic Astartes infantry and mounted units, which I assume means bikers. Seems like bikers and cavalry are going to be meshed together into a single keyword, which I appreciate. That makes a lot of sense. It gives all of those a 4+ invulnerable save. Now, this is a little bit different. It doesn't affect vehicles. It doesn't affect the heavier stuff in your army. It's only going to be your infantry, so honestly, a little bit less exciting than the full rerolls, but a 4+ invulnerable save is a huge defensive buff. It probably won't work on Chaos Terminators because they will already have a 4+ invulnerable save, but if he's leading hordes of Legionnaires, for example, that's going to make them incredibly difficult to kill. Last and maybe least is Lord of the Traitor Legions, which gives Heretic Astartes unit within 6 rerolls on leadership and battle shock tests for the unit. Now, honestly, this doesn't sound very exciting, but the thing that you have to remember is that leadership checks are basically the core faction mechanic of Heretic Astartes, so all of your units are going to be taking leadership tests thanks to that Dark Pact ability basically every single turn. So rerolls on those, while certainly not as flashy as full rerolls or a 4+ invulnerable save, is certainly going to be useful, especially when you're buffing a ton of small Legionnaire units, all of whom are going to be taking those leadership checks. Now, in addition, Abaddon also supports your army with one of the coolest CP regeneration mechanics we've seen in the edition so far, in his Dark Destiny ability. Each time Abaddon makes a Dark Pact and does not fail the leadership test, which is on a 5+, potentially with a reroll thanks to Lord of the Traitor Legions, you roll a d6, and on a 2+, you gain a CP. Importantly, this is not restricted to once per turn. And assuming that there is no cap on the number of CP that you can regenerate in a turn, which I imagine they'll sort of limit the access to CP regeneration in this edition, so I don't know if that's going to be the case. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a cap, but I also wouldn't be surprised if there isn't and there's just a few ways to get CP every turn. You can potentially be triggering this multiple times per turn. Depending on the wording of how mechanics like Overwatch work and whether or not it skips the chosen to shoot or fight phase of the attack process like it does in the current edition, you can potentially be triggering this like 4 times per battle round, once in your own shooting phase, once in your fight phase, once in your opponent's movement phase, once in your opponent's charge phase, and then maybe again in your opponent's fight phase. If Abaddon gets to activate in all of those phases, for sure he can do it in his own shooting, fight, and opponent's fight phase, and each one of those has the potential to gain him a CP back. This is cool as hell. Not only is it incredibly strong CP regen, and especially given the fact that he does have the Talon of Horus, so he does have a 24-inch range, pretty reasonable ranged attack that he's going to be able to buff with Dark Pacts every turn. He's also just incentivized to get stuck in and do as much damage as possible, and because he's going to be rewarded with additional command points when he does. And I don't know if I could explain to you a more flavorful way for Abaddon to support his army than generating favor from the Dark Gods by getting engaged in glorious melee combat. Now, speaking of triggering Dark Pacts, the weapons he's going to be doing that with are no slouches either. He does have the Talon of Horus, his ranged attack. It is a 4-shot sustained hits weapon. Now, I don't know if this is going to stack with the sustained hits from Dark Pacts. It may make it sustained hits too. I wouldn't be surprised if numerical weapon attributes stack on top of each other, so you would just add all of your sustained hits levels together. I don't know that, though. So the other option is that you can always just Dark Pact for the Gene Rot Might effect of auto wounding on hit rolls of 6, which is going to be pretty useful, especially against heavily armored targets because it is only strength 5. It does hit on 2s, AP 1, 2 damage profile, and being able to attack with 4 attacks out to the maximum range does make this a pretty reasonable ranged attack. And mostly it's just exciting that Abaddon has a good ranged attack because he wants to be triggering it as much as possible so that he can form more Dark Pacts with the Chaos Gods. The profiles for these look very similar to Guilliman's, and I think the intention that he's very much a dark mirror of Guilliman, having a similar faction support effect, economy, and having similar attacks. Draknyen is his armor piercing profile, coming in with 8 attacks at strength 14, AP 4, 3 damage, just a little bit of a downgrade from the big fist that Guilliman swings, as well as the Talon of Horus, which comes in at 14 attacks, strength 7, AP 3, 1 damage for clearing through lighter infantry. Both of these have the devastating wounds characteristic, which converts their wound rolls to mortal wounds on the wound roll of a 6. And when you assume that either of them can benefit from potentially full rerolls to hit and exploding 6s from a Dark Pact, then they're actually going to be pretty terrifying. You're going to be generating additional hits on your hit rolls of 6, which then potentially have chances to roll wound rolls of 6, which then converts them directly into mortal wounds, which actually makes Draknyen not even that bad at carrying infantry itself, since converting 3 damage into 3 mortal wounds will just kill 3 1-wound infantry off the bat with no saves allowed. As befits the Chosen of the Dark Gods, Abaddon also has all of the Chaos God keywords, with different marks giving different benefits depending on stratagems. And speaking of which, we do have an example of how that works. So it sounds like the first Chaos Space Marine detachment that the faction is going to get access to is called Slaves to Darkness, taking the nomenclature directly out of Age of Sigmar, I guess. This grants you access to the Dark Obscuration stratagem, which we basically have no idea what it does. You can use it when one of your Heretic Astartes units is selected as the target of an enemy ranged attack during their shooting phase. Until the end of the phase, that unit gains stealth. They don't tell you what stealth does, though, so I imagine that it's going to be the stealth ability that we've seen on sneaky subfactions like Raven Guard in the past, where you get the benefits of cover when you are far enough away from enemies, but we just literally have no confirmation. In addition, if you have the Nurgle keyword, you can only be selected as the target of a ranged attack if the attacking model is within 12. So what I imagine this does is it gives you +1 save if you're outside of 12, and if you're Nurgle, you become untargetable for future attacks, which seems really strong. What's cool about this is that it looks like the stratagems in Heretic Astartes are going to have some pretty reasonable effects, like we've seen in the Tyranid article, where the stratagems themselves are going to be useful, but when you use them in very specific circumstances, in this case targeting a Nurgle unit, and in the Endless Swarm stratagem we saw previously, when you target units within Synapse range, you get an additional effect. And that's really cool. It gives you stratagems that are useful across the breadth of your army, but you can mark your units if you want to benefit from specific stratagems a little bit more effectively. And it really highlights some stratagems that you can use most often if you play an army that's entirely themed off of a specific Chaos God, but without removing access to the other existing stratagems. I think it's a really nice way to give you a little bit of a reward for playing flavorful or useful Chaos God marks, but without actually taking away options from the army on the whole. Now, what are we going to be protecting with this Dark Obscuration? We do have some weapon profiles that we can talk about as well. We see a profile for the Bale Flamer weapon, which is most likely going to be on both this guy and on the Lord Discordant, because they both have Bale Flamers. And this thing has gotten a pretty serious glow up. It has lost a pip of AP, going from AP2 down to AP1, which is a little bit unfortunate, but one thing you have to remember is that it now ignores cover. While it is lower AP, your opponents are never benefiting from light cover against it, so in most situations, especially when targeting infantry, it's gonna be the same. In addition, it's gone from having 2 D3 attacks to D6 plus 3, a massive increase in its average number of attacks and even the cap of attacks it could make. It went from going from 2 to 6 attacks to now 4 to 9 with an average of 6.5. And auto hits all of those attacks. Not very useful at shooting at vehicles now, especially since most heavily armored tanks, it's going to be wounding on 6s. It will be able to shoot lighter vehicles and do just fine. But for the most part, cooking medium infantry like enemy intercessors, gene stealers, or heretic legionnaires, those are all going to be extremely valuable targets for weapons like this Bale Flamer. Now, I think even a little bit more exciting, we've seen new profiles for the Chaos Obliterators flesh metal guns. These have been a roller coaster ride through editions. Either they're super random and not very good, they are too consistent and incredibly strong, or just kind of in the middle and not very useful. And this one seems like a little bit of a side grade from the current version with some big upsides. The Warp Hail weapon has been debuffed significantly, going from D6 plus 9 strength 5 AP1 shots to now D6 plus 3, but with the built-in sustained hits ability. Again, we don't know if that stacks with Dark Pact sustained hits, but either way, you're going to be able to auto-wound on 6s, which is fine, I guess. The middle profile, Ruinous Salvo, has gotten a little bit of an increase, going from strength 7 AP2 to strength 8, although with the increased toughness of vehicles, it is actually going to be a little bit less good. It's gone from D3 plus 3 attacks to a flat D6, but with the blast keyword, which may give it some additional hits against larger units. I think the intention here is that you're going to be firing at mediums to large sized units of 2 wound enemies, in which case it's going to be a very solid profile, but most of the time it's not that exciting. Last, and certainly not least, is the Focused Malice ability, which has gotten an enormous improvement. This thing has retained its D3 shots, but gone from strength 9 in the previous edition up to strength 12. It's kept its high AP value of 4 and 4 damage, but gained the Melta 2 ability. Given that it has a 24-inch range, this gives it 2 additional damage if it targets a unit within 12 inches, putting it up to a staggering damage of 6. Assuming that Obliterators retain their ability to Warp Strike onto the table and Deep Strike outside 9 inches of enemy units, they're going to be able to trigger the Melta ability on these weapons very consistently. And if they do, firing D3 6 damage, high strength, high AP shots into a target is enormous. Obviously, Strength 12 is kind of a little bit of a side grade from Strength 9. It is a lot better against low toughness enemies, but high armor vehicles, it's going to wound on 4s rather than wounding most of the game on 3s like Strength 9 did in 9th edition. That said, if it's firing medium armor vehicles, anything below toughness 12, the characteristic is going to be relatively the same, and this gun is going to absolutely vaporize them. It may even obliterate them. We have to remember that there is no more core keyword support within the faction, meaning that Abaddon's full rerolls aura does work on these guys. They're going to be able to potentially teleport within a centrally located Abaddon's range, get a bunch of attacks hitting on 3s with either exploding 6s or auto wounding on 6s, rerolling all those misses into high strength, high AP, 6 damage gunshots. Now, we don't know any other mechanics for these guys, so we don't know if they've kept their ability to fire within engagement range, but on the whole, I'd be very excited about that Melta profile. The Warp Hail profile, a little bit less exciting, but obviously sustained hits and auto wounding is, I guess, okay. Significantly lower volume than we've seen in the past, but at least the big shots do much more damage than they did previously. And with that, that's the entirety of the Chaos Space Marine faction. I really like the angle that they're going for with Chaos Space Marines. Their faction ability to trade off potential mortal wounds in order to supercharge their attacks is super fluffy, and given that the faction has a lot of mechanics that interact with that army role, it's going to be really powerful too. Abaddon looks like an absolute powerhouse. Well, he's easier to kill than he was in the past. He has a lot of fluffy army support abilities that are going to be super powerful, and importantly, can support anything in the army. And the upgraded weapon profiles look pretty devastating as well. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these changes to Heretic Astartes. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.